At table number 1, in front of 200 guests, my son looked directly into my eyes and said, "This seat is for my mother-in-law. Get out of here." The words cut through the wedding reception like a knife through silk. I felt every conversation stop, every eye turn toward us, every breath held in anticipation of my response. But I said nothing. I simply gathered my purse, straightened my shoulders, and walked away from the table I had paid for, at the wedding I had financed, leaving behind the son I had raised alone for 28 years. Can you imagine being humiliated by your own child in front of everyone you know? What would you do if the person you sacrificed everything for treated you like a stranger at the most important moment of their life? I walked out of that reception hall with my head high, but my heart was shattered into 1,000 pieces. However, I already knew that the next morning, when my phone would inevitably ring, my response would change the course of our relationship forever. My name is Caroline Prescott. I am 62 years old, a retired corporate lawyer who spent 30 years building a successful practice in Manhattan. After my husband died when James was only 3, I devoted every breath, every dollar, every dream to ensuring my son had the best life possible. I worked 16-hour days, missed social events, turned down romantic relationships, all so he could have private schools, violin lessons, summer camps, and eventually a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. That night, 24 hours before James humiliated me at his wedding, I had handed him the keys to my beach house in the Hamptons as an early wedding gift. The same house where he had spent every summer of his childhood, where I had taught him to swim, where we had built sandcastles and shared our deepest conversations during those precious father-son moments that never came because his father wasn't there. But let me go back to the beginning of this story, because what happened at that wedding didn't start that day. It started 6 months earlier, when James introduced me to his fiancée, Miranda, and her mother, Victoria Ashford. Victoria Ashford was everything I apparently wasn't. She was married to a successful businessman, lived in a mansion in Connecticut, and had never worked a day in her life. She was the kind of woman who organized charity galas not out of genuine compassion, but to see her name in society magazines. The kind of woman who looked at me and saw exactly what I was, a working mother who had raised her son alone, who had calluses on her hands from building her own success, who had never had the luxury of being just decorative. From our first meeting, Victoria made it clear that she considered herself superior. She would make subtle comments about career women who neglect their families, always with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. She would talk about how important it was for children to have proper guidance and stable family structures. Each word was a carefully aimed arrow at my choices, my sacrifices, my life. But James, my brilliant son, who had inherited my intelligence and should have seen through her manipulation, began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, he started canceling our weekly dinners. He stopped calling every Sunday, as he had done religiously for years. When I asked about wedding planning, he would say that Victoria is handling everything, or that Miranda prefers her mother's suggestions. The signs were all there, but I chose to ignore them because I couldn't believe my own son was allowing himself to be influenced against me. I was the woman who had sat by his bedside through pneumonia when he was 7. I was the one who drove him to debate tournaments on weekends. I was the one who celebrated every victory and consoled every defeat. How could he forget all of that? The answer came at the wedding rehearsal dinner, the night before the ceremony. Victoria had seated me at a table in the back with people I didn't know, while she held court at the main table with James and Miranda. When I approached my son to ask about the seating arrangement, he looked at me with those eyes that once looked at me with love and admiration, and said, "Mom, Victoria thinks it would be better if you kept a lower profile tomorrow." You know how emotional you can get. Emotional. That's how she had labeled my 30 years of dedication. Emotional. As if fighting for my son's future, working until exhaustion, sacrificing my own happiness, was some kind of character flaw that needed to be managed. That night, I went back to my hotel room and did something I hadn't done since my husband's funeral. I cried until there were no tears left, but somewhere between the tears and the dawn, something inside me changed. I realized that I had raised a son who was allowing his new family to erase me from his life, and I had been accepting it in the name of keeping the peace. The next day, at the wedding ceremony, I watched my son marry the woman he loved while her mother orchestrated every moment to minimize my presence. I was relegated to the third row while Victoria sat in the front row as if she were the mother of the groom. I watched James look toward Victoria for approval during his vows, not toward me. I saw him embrace her first after the ceremony, before even looking for me. And then came the reception, where the final humiliation awaited me. When I arrived at the reception hall that I had helped finance, I found my assigned table near the kitchen, while Victoria occupied the place of honor at the main table. But something inside me had shifted. Instead of accepting this final insult, I walked directly to the main table, to the empty chair that should have been mine as the mother of the groom. That's when James looked at me with a mixture of embarrassment and anger and said those words that would change everything. "This seat is for my mother-in-law. Get out of here." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me, waiting to see how the discarded mother would react. Victoria had a satisfied smile on her face, as if she had finally achieved her goal of completely replacing me in my son's life. But I didn't give them the spectacle they expected. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't cause a scene. I simply looked at my son, the boy I had raised to be better than this, and said quietly, "I understand, James. I truly understand." And I left. I walked out of that reception hall with more dignity than I felt, knowing that every guest was watching, knowing that some were judging me, others were pitying me, and a few were probably admiring my composure. What they didn't know was that my silence wasn't defeat. It was preparation. If you've ever felt discarded by someone you sacrificed everything for, subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments. How far would you go to protect your dignity? Because what I'm about to tell you next will show you that sometimes silence is the most powerful weapon a woman can possess. I woke up the next morning in my hotel room with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The humiliation from the night before had crystallized into something much more powerful, absolute certainty about who my son had become and what I needed to do about it. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, my phone rang. James's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I considered not answering. But I knew this conversation was inevitable, and I had spent the sleepless night preparing for it. "Mom?" His voice was different from the cold tone he had used the night before. Now he sounded uncertain, almost childlike. "We need to talk." "Good morning, James," I replied calmly. "How was your wedding night?" There was a pause. He had probably expected tears, apologies, or desperate attempts to reconcile. My composed tone clearly threw him off balance. "Listen, about last night. Maybe I was a bit harsh, but Victoria thought, I interrupted softly. "Yes, I'm beginning to understand how decisions are made in your new life. It's not like that, Mom. It's just that this was Miranda's day, and her mother had specific ideas about how things should be organized. Specific ideas that included humiliating me in front of 200 people? Another pause. I could hear him breathing, probably searching for words that would minimize what had happened without actually taking responsibility for it. "Look, I called because Miranda and I are leaving for our honeymoon in Tuscany this afternoon, and we were wondering if we could use the beach house for a few days when we get back. You know how much that place means to me, and I wanted to show it to Miranda properly." And there it was, the audacity that Victoria Ashford had cultivated in my son. 24 hours after publicly discarding me, he was calling to ask for favors. He wanted to take his new wife to the house where I had raised him, where every room held memories of our life together, where I had poured my heart into creating a sanctuary for us. "The beach house," I repeated slowly. "You want to take Miranda to the beach house?" "Yes. I thought maybe a week or two. It would be perfect for us to decompress after all the wedding stress, and Miranda has never seen the Hamptons properly." I closed my eyes and saw that house as it really was, not just a property, but a repository of everything I had built for my son. The kitchen where I had taught him to cook his first meal, the library where we had read together every summer evening, the master bedroom where he had crawled into bed with me during thunderstorms, even as a teenager after particularly difficult nightmares about his father. "James," I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm, "do you remember the last conversation we had in that house?" "What do you mean?" "It was 3 months ago. You were sitting on the deck, and I was bringing you coffee the way you like it, with extra cream and a touch of cinnamon. You took my hands and said, "Mom, I know I haven't said this enough, but thank you for everything. Thank you for being both father and mother to me. Thank you for never giving up." Do you remember that? The silence stretched between us. I knew he remembered because that had been one of our last, genuine moments before Victoria's influence completely poisoned our relationship. "I remember," he whispered. "And do you remember what you promised me that day?" "Mom, you promised me that no matter what happened in your life, no matter who came into it, I would always be your priority. You said, 'You and I are a team, we always have been.'" Those were your exact words, James. I could hear him breathing heavily now. The young man who had humiliated me 12 hours earlier was starting to crumble under the weight of his own contradictions. "Things change, Mom. I have a wife now, and I have to consider her feelings." "Her feelings," I repeated. "And what about mine? What about the feelings of the woman who worked 3 jobs to pay for your Harvard education? What about the feelings of the woman who gave up her social life, her romantic possibilities, her own dreams, so you could have everything you wanted?" "That was your choice," he burst out. And there it was, Victoria's voice coming through my son's mouth. "I never asked you to sacrifice everything for me." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how completely Victoria had rewritten our history in his mind. She had taken 30 years of love and devotion and transformed them into guilt and obligation. "You're absolutely right, James," I said, my voice still eerily calm. "It was my choice. Every single sacrifice was my choice, and now I'm making another choice." "What do you mean? The beach house?" The answer is no. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear his breathing change from nervous to panicked. "No? But Mom, you always said that house was as much mine as yours." "When you were my son, it was. But last night, in front of 200 witnesses, you made it very clear that I am no longer your mother in any meaningful way. You chose Victoria Ashford as your family. So go to Victoria. Ask her for her beach house." "This is ridiculous. You're being dramatic." "Dramatic!" I tasted the word like bitter medicine. "That's exactly what Victoria said I would be, isn't it? She prepared you for this conversation, didn't she, James? She told you that when you called asking for the house, I would be emotional and dramatic, but that you should stand firm because that's just how women like me behave." The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me I had hit the target perfectly. "How did you—" "Because I'm not the foolish, emotional woman you've been taught to see me as. I'm a corporate lawyer with 30 years of experience reading people, predicting their moves, and staying 3 steps ahead of their strategies. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize a coordinated campaign when I saw one?" "Campaign? Mom, you're being paranoid." "Am I? Let's review the evidence, shall we? 6 months ago, you canceled our weekly dinners. 4 months ago, you stopped calling on Sundays. 3 months ago, you started making excuses not to include me in wedding planning. 2 weeks ago, you forgot to invite me to the rehearsal until I called asking about it. And last night, you publicly humiliated me at an event I helped pay for. If that's not a campaign, what would you call it?" Each point landed with the precision of a legal argument because that's exactly what it was. I was cross-examining my own son, and we both knew he had no defense. Things got complicated with the wedding planning. Things got complicated the moment you allowed another woman to replace me in your life without even having the courage to tell me directly. You chose the coward's way, James. You chose to let Victoria orchestrate my gradual elimination instead of having an honest conversation with me. She's not trying to eliminate you. Really? Then explain to me why she seated me in the back row at your wedding. Explain why she put me at a table with strangers while she occupied the place of honor. Explain why she convinced you that asking for my place at the main table was appropriate. She just wanted everything to be perfect for Miranda. Perfect. And in Victoria's perfect world, the woman who raised you single-handedly has no place at her own son's wedding. I could hear him starting to cry, and for a moment, my maternal instinct almost took over. Almost. But then I remembered the look in his eyes when he told me to get out of my seat, the coldness, the complete absence of the love that had once defined our relationship. The beach house stays locked, James. The keys stay with me. If you want a vacation home for your honeymoon recovery, I suggest you ask your new mother-in-law to provide one. Mom, please, you're being unreasonable. Unreasonable? I laughed, and it was a sound without humor. James, I'm being perfectly reasonable for the first time in months. I'm simply matching my treatment of you to your treatment of me. I love you, Mom. No, I said quietly. You love the idea of me. You love what I can provide for you. You love having a mother when it's convenient and beneficial. But you don't love me enough to defend me, protect me, or even respect me when it matters. The sobbing on the other end grew louder, and I realized this was the moment Victoria hadn't prepared him for. She had told him I would be emotional, but she hadn't warned him that I might be rational instead. What do you want from me? He cried. Nothing, James. That's what you failed to understand. I don't want anything from you anymore. For 30 years I wanted your love, your respect, your loyalty. But last night, you made it crystal clear that those things are not available to me in your new life. That's not true. Then prove it, I said simply. Call Victoria right now. Tell her you made a mistake last night. Tell her that you're going to publicly apologize to me, and that from now on, I will be treated with the respect a mother deserves. Tell her that if she can't accept that, maybe she needs to reconsider her role in your marriage. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I can't do that, Mom. It would cause problems in my marriage. And there's your answer, James. You can't defend your mother because it would cause problems with the woman who spent 6 months systematically destroying our relationship. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. You're being unfair. Unfair? The word came out sharper than I intended. I'll tell you what's unfair, James. Unfair is working 16-hour days so your son can have violin lessons. Unfair is giving up dating for 15 years so your child won't feel like he's competing for attention. Unfair is paying for a wedding where you're treated like an unwelcome guest. That's unfair. I could hear him breathing heavily, probably realizing for the first time the true scope of what he had done. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know you are, sweetheart. But sorry doesn't undo last night. Sorry doesn't erase the humiliation. And sorry certainly doesn't give me back the son I thought I had raised. The line went quiet, except for his crying, and I felt something break inside me. Not my resolve, but the last thread of hope I had been carrying, that this could somehow be fixed with a simple conversation. Enjoy your honeymoon, James, I said gently. And when you get back, enjoy building your new life with your new family. But build it without expecting anything else from me. Mom, wait! I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my hotel room, feeling simultaneously empty and filled with a strange kind of peace. For the first time in months, I wasn't pretending that everything was fine. I wasn't making excuses for my son's behavior. I wasn't accepting crumbs of affection and calling it love. I was done, but I wasn't broken. 3 days after that phone call, I was sitting in my Manhattan apartment, staring at the wedding photos Miranda had posted on social media. Every image told the story Victoria had carefully crafted, a perfect family celebration where I was either absent or relegated to the background like an afterthought. But as I scrolled through those pictures with the analytical eye that had served me well in 30 years of legal practice, I began to notice details that revealed a much more complex story. In one photo, James was looking directly at the empty chair where I should have been sitting, his smile forced and his eyes hollow. In another, Miranda appeared to be arguing with her mother, her face tight with stress. And in a third, I caught something that made my blood run cold. Victoria, whispering something into the ear of my son's business partner, Richard Hamilton, both of them looking in my direction with calculating expressions. That's when I realized this wasn't just about wedding seating arrangements or family dynamics. Victoria Ashford wasn't just trying to replace me as James's mother figure. She was conducting a systematic campaign to isolate me from every aspect of my son's life. And she had been planning this for far longer than 6 months. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 2 years. Patricia Chen's office. This is Jennifer speaking. Jennifer, this is Caroline Prescott. Is Patricia available? It's rather urgent. Patricia Chen had been my closest friend and colleague during our years together at Morrison, Klein & Associates. She was also the best private investigator I knew. having left corporate law 5 years earlier to start her own firm specializing in what she called delicate family situations. Within an hour, Patricia was sitting in my living room, her sharp eyes taking in my appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen too many people at their breaking point. "You look like hell, Caroline," she said without preamble, "but your voice on the phone sounded like the old you, the one who could dissect a hostile witness in 10 minutes flat." Maybe because I finally stopped seeing this as a family problem and started recognizing it as a case, I replied. "Patricia, I need to understand exactly what's been happening to my relationship with James, and I need to know who's been orchestrating it." I told her everything. The gradual changes in James's behavior, Victoria's subtle hostilities, the wedding humiliation, and the phone call about the beach house. Patricia listened with the professional detachment that had made her so effective in court, occasionally asking sharp questions that forced me to examine details I had previously overlooked. "Caroline," she said when I finished, "what you're describing sounds like a classic parental alienation campaign. It's psychological warfare, and it's more common than people realize, especially when there's money involved." "Money? Think about it. You're a successful retired lawyer with significant assets. James is your only heir. Victoria's daughter just married into potential wealth, but there's an obstacle: you. The longer you maintain a close relationship with James, the more influence you have over inheritance decisions. But if you can be painted as emotionally unstable, possessive, or problematic, the implication hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Victoria wanting to be the primary maternal figure in James's life. This was about money, inheritance, and the systematic destruction of my relationship with my son to clear the path for Miranda's family to become the primary beneficiaries of my life's work. "I need you to investigate Victoria Ashford," I said. "Everything. Her background, her finances, her history with other family situations. And I need you to look into Richard Hamilton. James's business partner? Why him? Because I saw Victoria talking to him at the wedding like they were old friends, but James never mentioned that they knew each other. If this is really a campaign, she needs allies inside James's professional life." Patricia nodded, already making notes. "What's your budget for this investigation?" "Whatever it takes." "Patricia, they turned my son against me at his own wedding. They made me a stranger in my own child's life. I want to know who they really are and what they're really after." And then I looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about the woman I had been before I started making excuses for other people's cruelty. Then I'm going to remind them that they chose to go to war with a woman who spent 30 years winning battles in courtrooms against opponents much more sophisticated than they are. Patricia smiled for the first time since she arrived. "There's the Caroline Prescott I remember, the one who made opposing counsel cry during the Blackstone merger case." That afternoon, Patricia began her investigation while I started my own research. I pulled out every document related to my financial assets, my will, and the various trusts I had established for James over the years. I also began documenting every interaction I could remember with Victoria, creating a timeline that would have impressed any prosecutor. What I discovered in my own records was enlightening. Over the past year, James had asked me about my estate planning 3 times. Not casual questions, but specific inquiries about how my assets were structured, who would control what if something happened to me, and whether I had considered updating my arrangements now that he was getting married. At the time, I had thought he was just being responsible, planning for his future family. Now I realized these weren't his questions. Victoria had been using him to gather intelligence about my financial situation. I also found something else. A series of emails from Richard Hamilton to James about optimizing business structures for tax purposes and protecting family assets through strategic partnerships. The dates on these emails corresponded exactly with the timeline of Victoria's increasing influence over my son. By evening, I had filled 3 legal pads with notes and connections that painted a picture of a sophisticated, coordinated effort to position Miranda's family as the primary inheritors of my wealth, while simultaneously isolating me from James's life. My phone rang at 7:30. "Patricia, Caroline, you're going to want to sit down for this. What did you find? Victoria Ashford isn't who she appears to be. Her maiden name was Victoria Kowalski, and she grew up in a working-class family in Detroit. Her marriage to Robert Ashford 12 years ago was her second marriage. Her first husband died in a convenient accident that made her a wealthy widow, and there were questions about that death that were never fully resolved. I felt my blood chill. What kind of questions? The kind that insurance companies ask when a healthy 35-year-old man dies in a single car accident 3 months after increasing his life insurance policy. No charges were ever filed, but the insurance company fought the claim for 2 years before finally settling. And Robert Ashford? Married her 6 months after his first wife died of cancer. His adult children from his first marriage have been fighting him over estate issues ever since. They claim Victoria manipulated their father during his grief period and has been systematically cutting them out of inheritance decisions. The pattern was becoming crystal clear. Victoria Ashford was a professional manipulator who specialized in infiltrating families during vulnerable periods and repositioning herself as the primary beneficiary of their resources. There's more, Caroline. Richard Hamilton has gambling debts, serious ones, and 3 months ago, he received a large cash infusion that allowed him to pay off his most pressing obligations. The money trail is carefully hidden, but it leads back to a trust controlled by Victoria Ashford. She bought him. And I'm willing to bet that part of the deal involves him influencing James's business decisions in ways that benefit Miranda's family while undermining your position. I sat in my apartment that night, looking out at the city lights and feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family dynamics or wedding protocol. This was a criminal conspiracy designed to steal my life's work by destroying my relationship with my son. But Victoria Ashford had made one crucial mistake. She had targeted a woman who had spent 3 decades building cases, analyzing evidence, and destroying opponents who underestimated her intelligence. I opened my laptop and began typing. Not an emotional letter to my son, not a plea for reconciliation, but something much more dangerous, a legal strategy. Because Victoria was about to learn that when you declare war on Caroline Prescott, you had better be prepared for the consequences. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my former colleague at Morrison, Klein & Associates, requesting a consultation about complex inheritance fraud cases. The second was to my financial advisor, asking him to conduct a comprehensive audit of all accounts and assets that James had access to or knowledge of. The third call was to James himself. He answered on the second ring, his voice still carrying the uncertain tone from our last conversation. "Mom? Hello, James. How was Tuscany?" It was beautiful. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, and I want to try to fix things between us." "That's wonderful to hear, sweetheart. I've been doing some thinking too. In fact, I've been thinking about making some changes to my estate planning. Since you're married now, I want to make sure everything is structured properly for your new family." The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. He was probably signaling to someone, possibly Miranda or Victoria, who might be listening to our conversation. Changes? What kind of changes? Well, I'm considering establishing a new trust structure that would give Miranda's family some input into inheritance decisions. After all, they're part of our family now, and Victoria seems to have such strong opinions about proper financial planning. Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, you don't need to do anything dramatic. I mean, whatever you think is best, but..." "Oh, it wouldn't be dramatic at all. In fact, I've scheduled a meeting with my lawyer next week to discuss the options. Victoria seems like such a knowledgeable woman about these matters. Perhaps she would like to attend the meeting. As a family member, of course." I could hear whispering in the background, and then James's voice returned, slightly breathless. "Actually, that sounds like a great idea. Victoria has a lot of experience with estate planning, and she'd probably have some valuable insights." "Perfect. I'll have my assistant call her with the details." After I hung up, I sat back and smiled for the first time in weeks. Victoria Ashford thought she was playing chess with a grieving mother. She was about to discover she was actually playing with a master strategist who had just set the opening trap. The investigation was just beginning, but I already knew how this story would end. Victoria had chosen the wrong family to target, and she had gravely underestimated the wrong woman. If you believe that justice sometimes requires patience and strategy, subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? Because what I discovered next about Victoria's past would change everything, and the trap I was setting would soon reveal exactly who she really was. The meeting with my lawyer was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. I had chosen Marcus Wellington specifically because he specialized in complex estate fraud cases and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when protecting his clients' interests. More importantly, he had worked with me on several high-stakes cases during my corporate years and understood my methodology. Victoria arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in what I'm sure she considered appropriate attire for meeting with lawyers: a conservative navy suit, understated jewelry, and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested she was accustomed to getting her way in professional settings. "Caroline," she said, embracing me with the practiced warmth of someone who had perfected the art of manipulation. "How thoughtful of you to include me in these important family decisions." "Of course, Victoria. After all, you've made it quite clear that you consider yourself part of James's family now." We were seated in Marcus's conference room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, when James and Miranda arrived. My son looked nervous, constantly glancing at Victoria as if seeking approval or instruction. Miranda, on the other hand, appeared uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Marcus entered with his usual commanding presence, followed by Patricia Chen. Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment when she saw Patricia, but she recovered quickly. "I hope you don't mind," I said smoothly, "but I've asked Patricia to join us. She's been helping me organize some of my financial records, and I thought her expertise would be valuable." "Of course," Victoria replied, but I caught the calculating look she exchanged with James. Marcus began by explaining the current structure of my estate: the various trusts, investment accounts, the Manhattan apartment, the beach house, and the substantial portfolio I had built over 30 years of successful legal practice. The total value was significant enough to make everyone in the room sit up a little straighter. "Now," Marcus continued, "Caroline has asked me to explore options for including her new extended family in the inheritance structure. This would involve creating new trust mechanisms that would give certain family members input into financial decisions and potentially accelerate certain distributions." Victoria leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "That sounds very thoughtful, Caroline. I'm sure James and Miranda would appreciate having some security for their future." "Actually," I said, "I was thinking more broadly than that. Since you've become such an important influence in James's life, Victoria, I thought you should have direct input into these decisions as well." The surprise on her face was genuine this time. She had expected to work through James and Miranda, not to be offered direct access to my financial planning. "That's very generous of you, Caroline, but I wouldn't want to overstep." "Nonsense. You've made it clear that you consider yourself family now. And family looks out for each other, don't they?" Patricia opened her laptop and began projecting documents onto the conference room screen. "Before we proceed with any new trust structures," she said, "I think it's important that everyone understand the current beneficiaries and the legal requirements involved." The first document that appeared was my original will, clearly showing James as the primary beneficiary. The second document was a detailed breakdown of my assets. The third document was something Victoria wasn't expecting: a comprehensive background report. "As part of our due diligence," Patricia continued in her professional tone, "we always conduct background checks on anyone who would be involved in trust management or inheritance decisions. It's standard practice, really." Victoria's face went completely white as Patricia began reading from the report. "Victoria Marie Kowalski, currently Victoria Ashford, born in Detroit, Michigan. First marriage to David Kowalski ended with his death in a single-car accident in 2009. Life insurance payout of $800,000. Married Robert Ashford in 2011, 6 months after his first wife's death from cancer." "I don't understand what this has to do with Caroline's estate planning," Victoria said, her voice tight. "Well," Marcus interjected smoothly, "when someone is going to have access to financial decisions involving millions of dollars, we need to ensure they have a clean financial and legal history. Standard fiduciary responsibility, you understand," Patricia continued. "Since marrying Robert Ashford, Victoria has been involved in 3 separate legal disputes with his children from his first marriage regarding changes to their father's will and trust structures. In each case, the changes benefited Victoria directly while reducing the inheritance of Robert's biological children. James was staring at Victoria with growing confusion. "Victoria, you never mentioned any of this." "It's all perfectly legal," Victoria said quickly. "Families have disagreements about estates all the time. It doesn't mean anything." "Of course," I said gently. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about something else Patricia discovered." "The consulting work you've been doing?" Victoria's eyes darted between Patricia and me. "Consulting work?" "Yes. It seems you've been providing family mediation services to several wealthy families over the past decade. Always families where there's been a recent death or major life change, and always resulting in significant changes to inheritance structures that benefit your clients." The silence in the room was profound. James was looking at Victoria as if seeing her for the first time, while Miranda had gone completely pale. "Mrs. Ashford," Marcus said, his voice taking on the prosecutorial tone I remembered from our courtroom days. "Would you care to explain why you've been in contact with Richard Hamilton regarding James's business partnerships and Caroline's financial arrangements?" "I haven't. I don't know what you're talking about." Patricia clicked to the next document. A series of email exchanges between Victoria and Richard Hamilton discussing the Prescott situation and accelerating the timeline and ensuring minimal resistance from the target. The target. They had been referring to me as the target. "James," Victoria said, turning to my son with desperation creeping into her voice, "this is all a misunderstanding. Your mother is obviously feeling threatened by the changes in your life, and she's trying to create drama where none exists." But James was reading the emails Patricia had projected, and I could see the moment when the full scope of Victoria's manipulation became clear to him. His face went through a series of emotions: confusion, recognition, anger, and finally, horror. "You've been planning this," he said quietly. "You've been planning to isolate my mother from the beginning." "James, sweetheart, you have to understand." "Don't." His voice was sharp, and for the first time in months, he sounded like the son I had raised. "Don't call me sweetheart. Don't pretend this is about caring for me. You've been using me." Miranda spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Mother, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you didn't manipulate me into helping you hurt James's family." Victoria looked around the room, realizing that her carefully constructed facade had completely collapsed. The mask of concerned family member had slipped away, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "You people have no idea what you're dealing with," she said, her voice losing all pretense of warmth. "Caroline, you think you're so smart, but you have no idea how deep this goes. Richard Hamilton isn't just helping me with James's business decisions. He's been repositioning assets, restructuring partnerships, preparing for the moment when James would need to make difficult choices about caring for his aging, increasingly unstable mother." The room went dead silent. Victoria had just admitted to conspiracy, to financial manipulation, and to a coordinated campaign against me that went far beyond family dynamics. "You see," she continued, apparently deciding that if she was going down, she would take everyone with her. "The plan was never just about inheritance. It was about demonstrating that Caroline was becoming mentally incompetent, emotionally unstable, unable to manage her own affairs. We documented every emotional reaction, every time she seemed overly dramatic about family changes. We were building a case for conservatorship." James stood up so abruptly, his chair fell backward. "Conservatorship? You were trying to have my mother declared incompetent? It would have been better for everyone, James. She would have been cared for properly, and you and Miranda would have had access to the resources you needed to build your future without being held back by an increasingly difficult elderly woman. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Victoria hadn't just been trying to steal my money or replace me in my son's affections. She had been systematically building a legal case to have me declared mentally incompetent so that James, under her influence, could take control of my entire life. But she had made one fatal error. She had confessed to conspiracy and fraud in front of witnesses, including a lawyer who was recording every word. "Victoria," I said, my voice perfectly calm despite the rage burning inside me. "You've just admitted to criminal conspiracy, attempted fraud, and elder abuse in front of legal witnesses." The color drained from her face as she realized what she had done. "Marcus," I continued, I believe we have sufficient grounds for both criminal charges and civil action. Indeed we do, Carolyn. Patricia, I assume you've been documenting everything? Every word, every email, every financial transaction? Patricia confirmed. Victoria looked around the room like a trapped animal, finally understanding that she had walked into a carefully constructed legal trap. James, she said, her voice now pleading, you have to understand I was trying to protect your future. Get out, James said quietly. James, please, get out! He shouted, and it was the voice of the strong man I had raised, not the manipulated boy she had been controlling. Victoria gathered her purse and stood, but before leaving, she turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes. This isn't over, Caroline. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started. Actually, I replied, standing and meeting her gaze with 30 years of courtroom confidence, I know exactly what I've started. I've started the process of destroying someone who made the mistake of targeting my family. And Victoria, I'm very, very good at what I do. After she left, the room remained silent for several minutes. James sat with his head in his hands. Miranda was crying quietly, and I felt the satisfaction of a battle well fought and decisively won. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Victoria Ashford had revealed herself to be far more dangerous than I had initially realized, and her parting words suggested that she had resources and plans I hadn't yet discovered. The war was far from over, but for the first time in months, I felt like myself again, Caroline Prescott, the woman who had never lost a case that mattered. If you've ever wondered how predators choose their victims, subscribe now because what happened next revealed the full scope of Victoria's criminal network, and the evidence we uncovered would shock even the most experienced law enforcement officers. The real fight was just beginning. That evening, James came to my apartment alone. It was the first time in months that he had visited without Miranda, and the first time in even longer that he looked like the son I remembered. Vulnerable, ashamed, but finally awake. He stood in my doorway for a long moment before speaking. Mom, I don't even know how to begin to apologize for what I've done to you. I led him to the living room where we had shared so many conversations over the years, where I had helped him with homework, celebrated his achievements, and comforted him through heartbreaks. Now he sat across from me like a stranger trying to find his way back home. James, you were manipulated by a professional. Victoria Ashford has been doing this for years, destroying families and stealing inheritances. You weren't her first victim, and unfortunately, you won't be her last. But I should have seen it. I should have known that something was wrong when she started making those comments about you being too emotional or overly involved in my life. God, Mom, I let her convince me that your love was somehow unhealthy. The pain in his voice was genuine, but I needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening before I could even begin to consider forgiveness. Tell me everything, James. Every conversation with Victoria, every suggestion she made, every time she influenced a decision about me. I need to understand how deep this manipulation went. For the next 2 hours, my son told me a story that was even more sinister than I had realized. Victoria hadn't just been working to isolate me from James's life. She had been systematically documenting my behavior, creating a psychological profile that would support a conservatorship petition. She had encouraged James to secretly record some of our phone conversations, claiming it would help him understand my emotional patterns. She had convinced him to keep detailed notes about my reactions to wedding planning changes, describing my reasonable objections as evidence of increasing instability. She had even suggested that he have me evaluated by a psychiatrist she recommended, claiming it was for my own good. She said that elderly people often become paranoid and suspicious when their children get married, James said, his voice breaking. She convinced me that your objections to her involvement were signs of cognitive decline, not legitimate concerns about her behavior. The sophisticated cruelty of it was breathtaking. Victoria had been building a legal case for my incompetence while simultaneously creating the very conditions that would make me appear unstable. Every time she undermined my relationship with James, every time she excluded me from family decisions, every time she disrespected me, she was creating situations designed to provoke emotional responses that she could later use as evidence against me. James, did she ever ask you about my daily routines, my medical information, my relationships with friends or colleagues? Yes, constantly. She said it was important for her to understand our family dynamics so she could help Miranda fit in better. She asked about your health, your social life, whether you seemed isolated or lonely. She even asked about your driving habits and whether you seemed confused about finances. She had been conducting a comprehensive assessment of my vulnerabilities, looking for any angle that could be used to support a competency challenge. The wedding humiliation wasn't just about putting me in my place, it was about creating a public scene that would support their narrative of an unstable, attention-seeking elderly woman. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Patricia, Caroline, you need to know what we've uncovered. Victoria Ashford isn't working alone, and this conspiracy is much larger than we initially thought. How much larger? We've identified at least 6 other families over the past decade where Victoria has been involved in similar situations. Wealthy elderly individuals, usually widowed, usually with substantial assets, and adult children who could be manipulated into supporting conservatorship proceedings. I felt my blood turn to ice. How many were successful? 4. 4 elderly people are currently under conservatorships that Victoria helped orchestrate, and in each case, the family members who gained control of their assets have mysteriously made substantial financial decisions that benefit Victoria's network. Network? Caroline, this isn't just Victoria. She's part of an organized group that specializes in targeting wealthy elderly individuals. They have lawyers, psychiatrists, financial advisors, even judges who are part of the system. It's sophisticated, it's coordinated, and it's been operating for years. The implications hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't just been the target of one manipulative woman. I had been selected by a criminal organization that had perfected the art of legal theft through fraudulent conservatorships. Patricia, how did they choose me? We're still investigating, but it appears someone flagged you as a potential target almost 2 years ago. Wealthy widow, single adult child, substantial liquid assets, and a strong relationship with your son that could be exploited. You checked all their boxes. James was listening to my side of the conversation with growing horror. When I hung up, he looked at me with tears streaming down his face. Mom, I almost helped them destroy you. I almost gave them everything they needed to take away your freedom, your dignity, your entire life. But you didn't, I said firmly. When you saw the evidence today, you chose to believe the truth instead of their lies. That matters, James. How can you even look at me? How can you not hate me for what I almost did? I studied my son's face, seeing both the man he had become and the boy I had raised. The anger I had been carrying for months was still there, but it was being joined by something else. Understanding of just how sophisticated and dangerous our enemies really were. James, I need you to understand something. If we're going to fight this network, if we're going to stop them from destroying other families, I need to know that you're completely committed to the truth, no matter how difficult it becomes. I am, Mom. I swear to you, I am. Then I need you to help me understand everything Victoria knew about our family, our finances, our relationships. Because if we're going to destroy this organization, we need to understand exactly how they operate. Over the next several hours, James told me everything he could remember about Victoria's questions and conversations. As he talked, I began to see the sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation that had been conducted against me. Victoria had learned about my closest friendships and had systematically arranged for James to have conflicts with those friends that would isolate me socially. She had discovered my charitable contributions and had convinced James that I was being taken advantage of by organizations that were manipulating elderly donors. She had even identified my morning routine of walking in Central Park and had suggested to James that elderly people who walked alone might be developing signs of dementia that made them vulnerable to accidents or confusion. Every aspect of my life had been analyzed for weaknesses that could be exploited in a conservatorship proceeding. Victoria hadn't just been planning to steal my money. She had been planning to steal my entire existence, to have me declared incompetent and locked away while her network systematically dismantled everything I had built over a lifetime. James, I said when he finished his recounting, I need you to do something for me, and it's going to require you to be braver than you've ever been in your life. Anything, Mom. I'll do anything to make this right. I need you to contact Victoria and tell her that you've reconsidered your reaction at the lawyer's office. Tell her you think I manipulated you with false evidence and that you want to proceed with the original plan." "What? Mom? I can't." "James, we need her to reveal the full scope of this network. We need names, financial records, communication between the conspirators. The only way to get that information is to make her believe she still has a chance to succeed." The idea of asking my son to pretend to betray me again was almost unbearable, but I knew it was the only way to gather the evidence we would need to destroy this organization completely. "You want me to be a double agent. I want you to help me save other families from going through what we've been through. Victoria mentioned that Richard Hamilton has been restructuring your business partnerships. If that's true, there may be financial crimes we can document, but we need access to their communications and plans." James was quiet for a long time, and I could see him wrestling with the complexity of what I was asking. Finally, he looked up at me with determination I hadn't seen in months. "What exactly do you need me to do?" "I need you to convince Victoria that you're willing to proceed with having me declared incompetent, and I need you to document every step of their process. We're going to give them enough rope to hang themselves, and then we're going to make sure they face justice for every family they've destroyed. And if something goes wrong, if they realize what we're doing—" I looked at my son and smiled with the confidence that had carried me through 30 years of high-stakes legal battles. "James, they made the mistake of targeting a woman who has spent her entire career destroying people who underestimate her intelligence. Victoria Ashford is about to learn what happens when you declare war on Caroline Prescott." That night, after James left, I sat in my apartment making detailed notes about everything we had learned. Victoria's network was sophisticated and dangerous, but they had also revealed crucial weaknesses. They were arrogant, they had been successful for too long, and they had never encountered someone with my resources and determination. More importantly, they had given me something I had been missing for months: a clear enemy and a righteous cause. I wasn't just fighting for my relationship with my son anymore. I was fighting to protect other families from the predators who had targeted mine. The hunt was about to begin. Subscribe now if you believe that evil should never go unpunished, because what James discovered when he re-engaged with Victoria's network would expose a conspiracy so vast and cruel that it would shock law enforcement across 3 states. The predators had no idea they were about to become the prey. The next morning, James called Victoria while I listened from another room, recording every word of the conversation that would either save other families from her network or put us both in serious danger. "Victoria?" James's voice was perfectly calibrated to sound confused and conflicted. "I need to talk to you about what happened yesterday." "James, thank God you called. I was so worried about you. Your mother really put on quite a performance, didn't she?" "That's what I wanted to talk about. After I got home and really thought about everything that was presented, I started to wonder if maybe Mom manipulated the whole situation to make you look bad." The pause on Victoria's end was telling. I could almost hear her recalculating, trying to determine if this was genuine or a trap. "What makes you think that?" "Well, it's just that some of the evidence seemed too convenient, you know? Like she had prepared all of this in advance to discredit you. And the way she handled the whole meeting, it was so calculated. It didn't feel like the emotional, unstable behavior you've been helping me recognize. James, your mother is far more cunning than you realize. What you saw yesterday was exactly the kind of manipulative behavior we've been discussing." She turned the tables on me to make herself look like the victim. Perfect. Victoria was taking the bait. "I keep thinking about what you said about her needing professional help, about the conservatorship option. Maybe we should have explored that more seriously before things got to this point." "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so glad you're starting to see clearly again. Your mother's performance yesterday was designed to make you doubt everything we've worked toward together. But you're right, we should have moved more quickly with the competency evaluation. Is it too late now? I mean, after yesterday's meeting, would anyone still take our concerns seriously?" Victoria's laugh was cold and calculating. "James, what happened yesterday actually works in our favor. Your mother's behavior, bringing in private investigators, making wild accusations, creating dramatic confrontations, all of that supports our position that she's becoming increasingly paranoid and unstable. I felt my hands clench into fists as I listened to her twist the truth with such practiced ease. So, what would be our next step? I think it's time you met some of our other associates, people who specialize in these delicate family situations. Can you meet me this afternoon? There are some people I'd like you to talk to. Of course. Where? The Metropolitan Club, 4 o'clock. And James? Don't mention this to Miranda just yet. She's still too emotionally involved to see the situation clearly. After James hung up, we sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing what we had just heard. Victoria was ready to introduce James to her network, which meant we would finally have access to the full scope of their operation. "Mom," James said quietly, "I felt sick lying to her like that." "I know, sweetheart. But remember, everything she's done to our family, she's done to others. We have a chance to stop her from destroying more lives." That afternoon, Patricia arrived at my apartment with electronic surveillance equipment that would allow us to monitor James's meeting with Victoria's associates. The technology was sophisticated enough to record conversations and transmit them in real time without being detected by standard security sweeps. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Patricia asked James as she fitted him with the nearly invisible recording device. "If they suspect what you're doing, this could become very dangerous very quickly." "I'm ready," James said, and I could hear the determination in his voice that reminded me of the boy who had never backed down from a challenge. At 3:30, James left for his meeting while Patricia and I settled in to monitor the situation from my apartment. The plan was simple. James would act interested in proceeding with the conservatorship while gathering as much information as possible about their methods, their other victims, and their financial arrangements. At 4:15, we heard Victoria's voice clearly through our monitoring system. "James, I'd like you to meet Dr. Gerald Hoffman and attorney Sarah Matthews. They've been helping families deal with situations like yours for many years." "It's a pleasure to meet you, James," came a smooth male voice that I assumed belonged to Dr. Hoffman. "Victoria has told us about your mother's concerning behaviors. It takes courage to acknowledge when a parent needs professional intervention. And we want you to know that everything we discuss today is completely confidential," added a woman's voice. Attorney Matthews. "Family situations like this require delicate handling and absolute discretion." For the next hour, I listened in horror as James was introduced to a sophisticated criminal network that had perfected the art of legal theft. Dr. Hoffman was a psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations that almost always concluded that the elderly subject was incapable of managing their own affairs. Attorney Matthews handled the legal proceedings with connections to judges who could fast-track conservatorship cases. But the most chilling revelation came when they began discussing their fee structure. "Now, James, I want you to understand that our services aren't inexpensive," Attorney Matthews explained. "A comprehensive conservatorship proceeding, especially one involving substantial assets like your mother's, requires extensive documentation, multiple professional evaluations, and careful coordination with the court system." "What kind of fees are we talking about?" "Our standard arrangement is 25% of the total estate value plus ongoing management fees of 5% annually for as long as the conservatorship remains in place." I felt my blood run cold. They were planning to steal millions of dollars from me while keeping me locked away under their legal control indefinitely. "That seems like quite a lot," James said carefully. "James," Victoria interjected, "you have to understand that your mother's estate is worth over $8 million. Even after our fees, you and Miranda would still inherit far more than most people see in a lifetime. And more importantly, your mother would receive proper care for her declining mental state." "How exactly does the process work?" James asked. Dr. Hoffman began explaining their methodology with the clinical detachment of someone describing a routine medical procedure. They would arrange for me to be evaluated by claiming I had become a danger to myself or others. The evaluation would take place in a controlled environment where my reactions could be documented and interpreted as evidence of incompetence. "The key is creating the right circumstances," Dr. Hoffman continued. "We arrange for the subject to be confronted with complex legal and financial documents under stressful conditions. Elderly individuals often become confused or agitated in these situations, which provides excellent documentation of their diminished capacity. They were describing a process of psychological torture designed to provoke the very reactions they would then use as evidence against their victims. "And once the conservatorship is established?" James asked. "Then the real work begins," Attorney Matthews said. "Asset reorganization, investment restructuring, care facility placement if necessary. We handle everything so the family doesn't have to deal with the difficult decisions." Care facility placement. They were planning to have me institutionalized while they systematically looted my life's work. "Have you handled cases similar to my mother's situation?" "Oh yes," Victoria said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "We've helped dozens of families over the years. Just last month, we completed a case involving a retired professor whose son was concerned about her increasing isolation and paranoia. She's now receiving excellent care at a lovely facility upstate while her family manages her affairs properly." They were talking about their victims like business transactions, with no recognition of the human lives they had destroyed. "James," Dr. I. Hoffman continued, "I want you to understand that what we're offering you is the chance to take control of a difficult situation before it spirals completely out of hand. Your mother's behavior yesterday, bringing in investigators, making accusations, creating dramatic scenes, these are classic signs of escalating paranoid delusions. And if we don't intervene soon," Attorney Matthews added, "she could do serious damage to her own financial security. Paranoid elderly individuals often make impulsive decisions about their assets, giving money to fraudulent charities, falling victim to scams, even destroying important documents in fits of confusion. They had an answer for everything, a professional justification for every aspect of their criminal enterprise." "What would be my role in all of this?" James asked. "As her closest family member, you would petition the court for conservatorship based on your concerns about her mental state," Attorney Matthews explained. "Dr. Hoffman would provide the professional evaluation supporting your petition, and I would handle all the legal proceedings." "How long does the process usually take?" "With proper documentation and the right judge, we can usually have temporary conservatorship established within 2 weeks," Victoria said. "Full conservatorship typically follows within 30 to 60 days. 2 weeks. They could have me declared incompetent and stripped of my rights in 2 weeks. And during that time, your mother would be temporarily relocated to a secure care facility for her own safety while the evaluation is completed," Dr. Hoffman said. "It's standard procedure to ensure the subject doesn't attempt to hide assets or interfere with the legal process. Secure care facility. Prison, in other words. They would lock me away while they stole everything I had worked for." "I think I need some time to process all of this," James said, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "Of course," Victoria replied. "This is a big decision. But James, I want you to remember that every day we delay is another day your mother could make decisions that damage her own interests or put herself at risk. Why don't you take tonight to think it over?" Attorney Matthews suggested. "We can meet again tomorrow evening to discuss the specifics of moving forward." "That sounds good," James agreed. "Same time, same place? Perfect. And James, remember that confidentiality is crucial at this stage. If your mother becomes aware of our plans, she might take steps to complicate the process or even flee the jurisdiction." They were coaching my son on how to betray me more effectively. After James returned to my apartment, we sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what we had learned. The network was even more sophisticated and ruthless than we had imagined, with connections throughout the legal and medical systems that made their criminal enterprise appear completely legitimate. "Mom," James said finally, his voice hollow with horror, "they've done this to dozens of people. They're talking about human beings like they're just business opportunities." "And they almost succeeded with us," I replied. "If you hadn't been brave enough to question their manipulation, I would be locked away in an institution right now while they dismantled everything I've built. What do we do now?" I looked at my son and smiled with the cold satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. "Now we give them exactly what they think they want. Tomorrow night, you're going to tell them you're ready to proceed with the conservatorship petition. And while they're celebrating their victory, we're going to document every aspect of their criminal network and hand them over to law enforcement. Isn't that dangerous? James, they're planning to destroy innocent people's lives for money. That's far more dangerous than anything we're risking." I spent that night preparing for the final phase of our operation, Victoria's network had shown us their complete playbook, revealed their methods and their associates, and given us everything we needed to destroy them. They thought they were closing in on their biggest score yet. What they didn't realize was that they had just walked into a trap set by someone who had never lost a case that mattered. The hunters were about to become the hunted. If you believe that predators who target the elderly deserve the harshest possible justice, hit that subscribe button now, because tomorrow night's meeting would expose the full criminal network, and what we captured on tape would lead to the biggest elder abuse prosecution in New York State history. The 24 hours between meetings were the longest of my life. Patricia spent the day coordinating with federal authorities who specialized in elder abuse and financial crimes, while I worked with Marcus to ensure every piece of evidence we gathered would be legally admissible in court. "Caroline," Marcus said as we reviewed the surveillance recordings from the previous day's meeting, "what we have here is a RICO case. This isn't just elder abuse. It's an organized criminal enterprise that has been operating across state lines for years. How many victims are we talking about? Based on the preliminary investigation, at least 23 families in the past 5 years. Conservative estimate of stolen assets is over $45 million. The magnitude of their crimes was staggering. But what made it even more horrific was the human cost. These weren't just financial victims. They were elderly people who had been stripped of their dignity, their freedom, and their connections to their families. Patricia has been in contact with some of the other victims' families," Marcus continued. "Several of them suspected that something was wrong with the conservatorship proceedings, but they had no way to prove it. Your evidence could be the key to helping all of them." That evening, as James prepared for his second meeting with Victoria's network, I felt the familiar pre-battle calm that had served me well in countless courtroom confrontations. This time, however, the stakes were personal in a way they had never been before. "Remember," I told James as Patricia fitted him with even more sophisticated recording equipment, "tonight they're going to ask you to sign preliminary documents. You need to appear eager to proceed, but ask enough questions to get them to explain their entire process on tape. What if they become suspicious? They won't," I said with more confidence than I felt. "They're too arrogant, and they think they have you completely under their control. Just remember that everything they're planning to do to me, they've already done to dozens of other people." At 5:30 that evening, James left for the Metropolitan Club, while Patricia, Marcus, and I monitored the meeting from a surveillance van parked outside. This time, we weren't just recording for our own purposes. FBI agents were listening to every word through a direct feed. The meeting began promptly at 6 o'clock, with Victoria making introductions to 2 new members of their network, Dr. Rebecca Chen, a geriatric specialist who would provide additional medical testimony, and Michael Torres, a financial advisor who specialized in crisis asset protection. "James," Victoria began, "I'm so pleased you've decided to move forward with protecting your mother's interests. Dr. Chen and Mr. Torres are here to explain the next steps in the process. First, Dr. Chen said in a voice that was clinically detached, "We need to establish documentation of your mother's declining mental state. I'll need you to provide detailed accounts of her recent erratic behaviors, any instances of confusion or paranoia, and examples of poor judgment in financial or personal decisions." James played his role perfectly. "Well, there was the incident at my wedding where she created a scene about the seating arrangements. And yesterday, she brought in private investigators and made all those wild accusations. Does that help?" "Excellent examples," Dr. Chen replied. "Classic signs of paranoid delusions and attention-seeking behavior common in elderly individuals with developing dementia." I felt sick listening to them twist normal emotional reactions into symptoms of mental illness. "Now," Attorney Matthews interjected, "we'll need you to sign a petition requesting emergency conservatorship based on immediate danger to your mother's well-being. The beauty of emergency proceedings is that we can have her placed in protective custody within 48 hours. Protective custody? A secure medical facility where she can be properly evaluated without the distractions and stresses of her normal environment," Dr. Hoffman explained. "It's much easier to conduct accurate psychological assessments when the subject is in a controlled setting. Prison. They were describing prison and calling it protective custody." "How long would she be in this facility?" James asked. "The initial evaluation period is typically 30 days, Dr. Chen said. However, if we find evidence of significant cognitive impairment, we may recommend extended observation to ensure we have a complete picture of her condition. Michael Torres spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to handling large sums of money. During the evaluation period, we'll need to secure your mother's assets to prevent any impulsive financial decisions that could jeopardize her future care. I'll work with you to transfer control of her accounts and investments to a protective trust structure. Transfer control? Immediately? It's essential, Torres continued. Elderly individuals facing conservatorship proceedings often attempt to hide assets or make irrational financial decisions out of fear or confusion. By securing the assets early in the process, we protect everyone's interests. They were describing their systematic looting process as if it were a medical necessity. What exactly would my responsibilities be? James asked. As the petitioning family member, you would have temporary control over your mother's finances pending the outcome of the competency evaluation, Attorney Matthews explained. Of course, you would work closely with our team to ensure all decisions are made in her best interests. And your fees would be taken from her assets? That's correct, Victoria said smoothly. It's the standard arrangement, and it ensures that your mother's care is properly funded throughout the process. James was silent for a moment, and I could imagine him struggling with the horror of what he was hearing while maintaining his cover. This is a lot to process, he said finally. James, Victoria said, and her voice took on the manipulative maternal tone I had heard her use so many times before. I know this is difficult. No one wants to take control of their parent's life. But your mother's behavior has become increasingly erratic and potentially dangerous. Yesterday's performance with the investigators and lawyers could be just the beginning. What if she starts making wild accusations publicly? What if she begins giving money to fraudulent causes or falling victim to scams? Victoria's right, Dr. Hoffman added. Early intervention is crucial in cases like this. The longer we wait, the more damage your mother could do to herself and her relationships. And remember, Attorney Matthews said, everything we're doing is completely legal and court-supervised. Your mother will have legal representation throughout the process, and every decision will be reviewed by the court. Legal representation provided by lawyers who were part of their network, I realized. The entire system was corrupted from top to bottom. I keep thinking about what my mother said yesterday, James said carefully, about this being some kind of conspiracy. How do I know that what you're telling me is really in her best interests? The silence that followed was telling. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its warmth. James, that kind of thinking is exactly what your mother wants to achieve. She's trying to make you doubt the people who are genuinely trying to help your family. It's a classic manipulation tactic used by individuals with developing paranoid disorders. Your mother is sick, James, Dr. Chen added. And one of the symptoms of her illness is the inability to recognize that she needs help. She'll say anything, create any story, to maintain the illusion that she's still capable of managing her own affairs. The accusations she made yesterday about Victoria are perfect examples, Dr. Hoffman said, creating elaborate conspiracy theories to explain why people are concerned about her welfare is textbook paranoid behavior. They had an answer for everything. A professional justification for every aspect of their criminal enterprise that made their victims look like the problem. What if I'm wrong about this? James asked, and I could hear genuine anguish in his voice. What if my mother really is just trying to protect herself from people who want to hurt her? James, Torres said, his voice taking on a harder edge, your mother has over $8 million in assets. There are people out there who would love to take advantage of an elderly woman with that kind of wealth. The private investigator she hired, the lawyers she's consulting with. How do you know they're not the real predators here? The psychological manipulation was masterful. They were taking every legitimate concern James might have and turning it back on itself, making him doubt his own perceptions and instincts. Think about it logically, Victoria added. Your mother claims we're trying to steal her money, but we're the ones recommending legal, court-supervised proceedings with multiple professional evaluations. If we were really criminals, wouldn't we suggest something less visible, less documented? The truth is, Attorney Matthews said, what we're offering you is complete transparency. Every decision, every financial transaction, Every aspect of your mother's care will be documented and reviewed by the court system. A court system they had infiltrated and corrupted. But James couldn't say that without blowing his cover. I need to ask a difficult question, James said. What happens to people who go through this process? Do they ever regain control of their lives? The pause that followed was the longest yet. When Dr. Hoffman finally answered, his voice was carefully neutral. James, the goal is always to help individuals achieve their highest possible level of independence. However, the reality is that cognitive decline in elderly individuals is typically progressive. Most of our clients find that the structured care environment we provide offers them much better quality of life than they could achieve on their own. Most of their clients. Not some, not many, but most. They were admitting that they almost never allowed their victims to regain their freedom. What about visiting her? Would I be able to see my mother regularly? Of course, Victoria said quickly. Family connection is an important part of the care process. However, visits would need to be supervised initially to ensure they don't cause additional stress or confusion during the evaluation period. Supervised visits. They would control every aspect of my contact with my own son. I think I'm ready to move forward, James said, and I could hear the strain in his voice as he spoke the words that could potentially seal my fate if this were real. Wonderful, Victoria said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Attorney Matthews has prepared the preliminary paperwork. We can have the emergency petition filed first thing tomorrow morning. And your mother could be in protective custody by tomorrow evening, Dr. Hoffman added. It's really the kindest thing for everyone involved. For the next 30 minutes, I listened in horror as they walked James through the paperwork that would strip me of my rights and my freedom. Every document was designed to appear legitimate while actually facilitating the systematic theft of my entire life. There's just one more thing, Torres said as the meeting was winding down. We'll need access to your mother's financial records and account information to begin the asset protection process. Do you have access to that information? I have some of it, James said. She gave me emergency access to some accounts when I got married, in case anything ever happened to her. Perfect. If you could provide that information to us tonight, we can begin securing the assets immediately. This was it. They were asking James to provide them with direct access to my financial accounts. If this had been real, they would have been able to begin looting my assets within hours. Actually, James said, I'd prefer to handle the financial transition myself, working with your guidance. It seems more appropriate for family to handle those details. I felt a surge of pride at his response. He was protecting me while appearing to cooperate with their plans. Of course, Torres said smoothly. We completely understand. Family should always be involved in these sensitive decisions. The meeting concluded with schedules for filing the paperwork and arrangements for my protective custody. As James prepared to leave, Victoria made one final comment that chilled me to the bone. James, remember that once we begin this process, it's very important that your mother not become aware of what's happening until everything is properly arranged. If she tries to flee or hide assets, it could complicate the legal proceedings significantly. They were coaching him on how to betray me completely, how to ensure I would have no warning and no opportunity to defend myself. I understand, James said. I won't say anything to her. After James returned to my apartment and we had swept for surveillance devices, we sat in stunned silence reviewing what we had captured. The evidence was overwhelming. A complete criminal conspiracy involving dozens of professionals across multiple states, systematic financial fraud, elder abuse, and what amounted to kidnapping under the guise of medical care. Mom, James said, his voice breaking, listening to them talk about you like you were just another business opportunity. I wanted to stand up and scream at them. You did perfectly, James. What we captured tonight will destroy their entire network and free their current victims. Patricia arrived an hour later with FBI agents who reviewed our recordings and confirmed that we had documented enough criminal activity to bring down the entire organization. Mrs. Prescott, Agent Sarah Martinez said, what you've accomplished here is unprecedented. This network has been operating for years, and until tonight we had no way to prove their criminal activities. What happens next? Tomorrow morning, coordinated arrests across 3 states. By the time Victoria Ashford realizes what's happening, Her entire network will be in federal custody. I looked around my apartment at the team of people who had helped me turn the tables on predators who thought they had found the perfect victim. Victoria Ashford was about to learn that when you target Caroline Prescott, you had better be prepared for the consequences. The trap was set. Tomorrow morning, justice would finally be served. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's chapter will show you exactly what happens when federal agents take down a criminal network that thought they were untouchable. The hunters had become the hunted, and justice was about to be served in the most satisfying way possible. I woke up at 5:30 on the morning that would forever change the lives of Victoria Ashford and her criminal network. For the first time in months, I had slept deeply, dreamlessly, with the peace that comes from knowing that justice is finally within reach. Agent Martinez had called the night before to confirm that coordinated raids would begin at 7 o'clock sharp across New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Victoria's network had grown so large and sophisticated that it required a multi-state task force to bring them down. James arrived at my apartment at 6:15, looking like he hadn't slept at all. The strain of the past few days, of pretending to betray me while actually helping to save other families, had taken its toll on him. "Mom, I keep thinking about all the families they've destroyed," he said as we watched the sun rise over Manhattan. "All the elderly people who are locked away right now while these criminals steal their life savings. By noon today, those people will be free," I replied, "and their families will finally understand what really happened to them." Agent Martinez had explained that many of the network's current victims were being held in facilities under false conservatorships. Their families genuinely believed their elderly relatives were receiving necessary medical care, not realizing they had been manipulated into supporting what amounted to kidnapping and theft. At 6:45, my phone rang. "Patricia. Caroline, the teams are in position. Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready for this since the night Victoria convinced my son to humiliate me at his own wedding. The FBI wants you to know that your evidence is the cornerstone of this entire operation. Without what you and James captured, none of this would be possible." At exactly 7 o'clock, Agent Martinez called to tell me that the first arrest had been made. Dr. Gerald Hoffman had been taken into custody at his office as he arrived for his morning appointments. Within minutes, calls were coming in from agents across the tri-state area as the network was systematically dismantled. 7:15, Attorney Sarah Matthews arrested at her law firm. 7:23, Dr. Rebecca Chen taken into custody at her medical practice. 7:31, Michael Torres arrested at his financial advisory firm. 7:45, Richard Hamilton arrested at James's business office. Each arrest was coordinated to prevent any member of the network from warning the others. Years of planning and preparation had gone into ensuring that when they struck, they would capture everyone simultaneously. At 8:12, Agent Martinez called with the news I had been waiting for. "Mrs. Prescott, Victoria Ashford is in federal custody. She was arrested at her home in Connecticut as she was preparing to leave for a meeting with another potential victim family." I felt a wave of satisfaction, unlike anything I had experienced in my legal career. Victoria Ashford, who had spent months systematically destroying my relationship with my son while planning to steal my life savings and lock me away, was finally facing justice. What was her reaction? According to the arresting officers, she immediately began claiming that she was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by a paranoid elderly woman. Sound familiar? Even in custody, Victoria was still trying to use her playbook, still attempting to portray herself as the victim of someone else's delusions. But her manipulation tactics wouldn't work on federal agents armed with hours of recorded evidence. By 9 o'clock, the scale of the network's crimes was becoming clear. The FBI had executed search warrants on 17 locations, arrested 23 individuals, and frozen over $60 million in assets that had been stolen from elderly victims. More importantly, they had identified 37 current victims who were being held under fraudulent conservatorships. Emergency court orders were being sought to immediately review every case and begin the process of restoring these people's freedom. James and I spent the morning at the FBI field office, providing additional details about our experiences and helping agents understand the psychological manipulation tactics Victoria had used. It was both therapeutic and heartbreaking to recount our story while knowing that dozens of other families had endured similar or worse experiences. "Mrs. Prescott," Agent Martinez said during one of our breaks, "I want you to understand the magnitude of what you've accomplished here." This network had perfected their system to the point where they were essentially untouchable. They had corrupted judges, medical professionals, and legal officials across multiple jurisdictions. How were they able to operate for so long without being detected? Because they chose their victims carefully and isolated them completely from anyone who might advocate for them. Elderly individuals who were wealthy but socially isolated, with adult children who could be manipulated into supporting the conservatorship proceedings. And the families never suspected? The beauty of their system was that the families genuinely believed they were helping their elderly relatives. The medical and legal documentation was so sophisticated that it appeared completely legitimate. At 11:30, Agent Martinez received a call that made her smile for the first time since I had met her. "Mrs. Prescott, I have some news that I think you'll appreciate. Victoria Ashford has just been informed that her own assets are being frozen pending investigation into money laundering and racketeering charges. She's also been told that her current conservatorship cases are being reviewed by federal judges." The irony was perfect. Victoria, who had spent years stripping other people of their financial freedom, was now facing the same fate herself. "What's her legal situation?" "Based on the evidence you provided, she's looking at federal charges for conspiracy, elder abuse, fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Conservative estimate is 25 to 30 years in federal prison." 25 to 30 years. Victoria Ashford would spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying for the families she had destroyed and the elderly victims she had imprisoned. At noon, James and I were finally allowed to leave the FBI office. As we walked out into the bright Manhattan sunlight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace. "It's over," James said quietly. "No," I replied. "It's just beginning." "What do you mean?" "James, there are 37 elderly people who are about to be freed from facilities where they've been held against their will. There are families who are about to discover that their relatives aren't mentally ill. They're victims of crime. There are millions of dollars in stolen assets that need to be returned to their rightful owners. And what about us? What about our family?" I looked at my son, this man I had raised, who had been manipulated into nearly betraying me completely, who had then found the courage to help me expose the criminals who targeted our family. "We have a lot of work to do, James. We need to rebuild trust, repair damage, and learn how to be a family again. But we also have something most people never get: a second chance to do it right." That afternoon, we returned to my apartment where Miranda was waiting. She had spent the morning watching news reports about the massive federal operation that had dismantled an elder abuse network, not realizing that her own family had been at the center of it all. "Caroline," she said when she saw me, tears streaming down her face, "I am so sorry. I had no idea what my mother was doing. I thought she was just trying to help our family get closer." "Miranda, you were as much a victim of your mother's manipulation as James was. The important thing is that you're here now, and you're willing to be part of rebuilding our family." The three of us spent the evening talking, really talking, for the first time since James and Miranda had gotten engaged. We discussed the manipulation we had all experienced, the signs we had missed or ignored, and the work we would need to do to heal from the trauma Victoria had inflicted on our family. "Mom," James said as the evening was ending, "I need you to know that what happened at my wedding, the way I treated you, the things I said, none of that was really me. But I also need you to know that I take full responsibility for allowing myself to be manipulated. I should have been stronger. I should have trusted you. James, Victoria Ashford is a professional predator who has destroyed dozens of families. The fact that you were able to break free from her influence and help expose her network shows exactly who you really are. But I almost lost you. I almost helped them destroy you. Almost doesn't count, sweetheart. What counts is that when it mattered most, you chose to fight for our family instead of against it." That night, after James and Miranda had gone home, I sat in my apartment looking through the wedding photos that had once caused me such pain. Now they told a different story, not of my failure as a mother, but of my success in raising a son who could recognize evil and choose good, even when it cost him everything he thought he wanted. My phone rang at 10:30. "Agent Martinez." Mrs. Prescott, I thought you should know that we've just received word that the first of Victoria's victims has been released from custody. Margaret Thompson, a 74-year-old retired teacher who has been locked away for 8 months while Victoria's network stole her entire pension. How is she? Confused, frightened, but free. Her daughter is driving down from Boston to bring her home. She keeps asking if this is really over, if they can really go back to their normal life. And the answer? The answer is yes. Thanks to you, Mrs. Prescott, 37 families are going to get their loved ones back. After I hung up, I walked to my bedroom window and looked out at the city lights, thinking about all the families that had been torn apart by Victoria's network and all the elderly people who would wake up tomorrow as free citizens instead of prisoners. Victoria Ashford had made the mistake of targeting Caroline Prescott, but her real error had been underestimating the power of a mother's love and a lawyer's determination. She had declared war on the wrong family, and now she would spend the rest of her life paying the price. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, testimony, trials, and the long process of helping other families heal from similar trauma. But tonight, for the first time in months, I could sleep peacefully, knowing that justice had been served and that no other family would suffer what mine had endured. The predators had finally been stopped, and the hunters had become the hunted. Subscribe if you believe that evil should never go unpunished, because in the next chapter, you'll discover what happened when Victoria's victims were finally freed and the full scope of her criminal network was revealed. The story is far from over. Justice was just beginning. 3 days after Victoria's arrest, I received a phone call that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Agent Martinez was calling to tell me about Margaret Thompson, the 74-year-old retired teacher who had been the first victim released from Victoria's network. Mrs. Prescott, I need to prepare you for what you're about to hear. When we interviewed Margaret Thompson about her experience, she told us things about Victoria's facilities that are far worse than we initially understood. What do you mean? Margaret was being kept in what was essentially a prison, disguised as a medical facility. She was given daily medications that kept her sedated and confused. When she tried to call her daughter or contact a lawyer, she was told that her paranoid delusions were worsening and her medication doses were increased. I felt my blood run cold. They were drugging her into compliance. It gets worse. Margaret told us that she was repeatedly told her daughter had stopped visiting because she was too disturbed by her mother's declining mental state. In reality, Victoria's people were intercepting all communications and telling the daughter that visits would be too traumatic for Margaret in her current condition. The systematic cruelty of it was breathtaking. Victoria hadn't just been stealing money. She had been psychologically torturing elderly people while convincing their families that isolation was for their own good. Mrs. Prescott, Margaret asked me to give you a message. She said to tell you that if you hadn't been brave enough to fight back, she would have died in that facility, forgotten by her own family. That afternoon, I drove to the small Connecticut town where Margaret Thompson lived to meet the woman whose freedom had become the symbol of our victory over Victoria's network. I found a frail but determined elderly woman who reminded me painfully of what I could have become if James hadn't found the courage to help expose the conspiracy. "Caroline," Margaret said, gripping my hands with surprising strength. "They told me I was crazy for 8 months. Every time I said I wanted to go home, they increased my medication. Every time I asked to call my daughter, they told me she didn't want to talk to me. How did you survive it?" I held on to the truth. No matter what they gave me, no matter how confused the drugs made me, I knew in my heart that my daughter loved me and that something was terribly wrong. I just didn't know how to prove it. Margaret showed me the medical records from her time in Victoria's facility, documents that revealed the full scope of the medical abuse that was part of the network's operation. She had been given powerful antipsychotic medications despite having no history of mental illness, drugs that kept her docile and confused, while Victoria's people systematically drained her pension accounts. The worst part, Margaret continued, was listening to the other residents. There were dozens of us, all elderly people who had been convinced we were mentally ill, all separated from our families. Some of them had been there for years. Years? Caroline, there was a man named Harold who had been in that facility for 3 years. His son visited once a month, but Harold was so heavily medicated that he barely recognized him. The son genuinely believed his father had severe dementia and needed institutional care. The implications were staggering. Victoria's network hadn't just been stealing money. They had been operating what amounted to concentration camps for elderly people, using medical manipulation to justify keeping their victims imprisoned indefinitely. Over the following week, as more victims were released and interviewed, the true scope of Victoria's crimes became clear. The network had been operating 5 different facilities across 3 states, holding over 40 elderly people against their will while systematically looting their estates. But perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation came when I met with Harold's son, David, a man in his 50s who had spent 3 years believing his father was suffering from advanced dementia. "Mrs. Prescott," David said, tears streaming down his face, "for 3 years I've been visiting my father, thinking he was lost to me forever. They told me his confusion was getting worse, that he barely recognized me anymore. I thought I was losing him piece by piece. And now? Now I discover that they were drugging him into that state, that every time I visited, they had given him medications specifically designed to make him appear confused and disoriented. They stole 3 years of my relationship with my father. The psychological damage Victoria's network had inflicted on families was immeasurable. They hadn't just stolen money. They had stolen precious time, destroyed relationships, and traumatized both their direct victims and their families. On the 7th day after Victoria's arrest, Agent Martinez called with news that would reshape the entire case. "Mrs. Prescott, Victoria Ashford has decided to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. She's provided us with information about a much larger network operating in at least 12 states." Larger network? Victoria's operation was apparently a franchise of sorts. There's a national organization that provides training, resources, and coordination for these elder abuse networks. We're looking at potentially hundreds of victims across the country. The scope of the criminal enterprise was beyond anything I had imagined. Victoria hadn't been the mastermind. She had been one operator in a vast criminal organization that specialized in targeting elderly Americans. What kind of information is she providing? Names, locations, methods, financial structures. She's giving us everything in exchange for a recommendation of 15 years instead of 30. I felt a flash of anger at the idea of Victoria receiving a reduced sentence, but I understood the practical necessity of her cooperation if it meant stopping a national criminal network. That evening, James came to my apartment with news that added another layer to our understanding of how deeply we had been infiltrated. "Mom, I've been going through my business records with FBI forensic accountants. Richard Hamilton didn't just provide Victoria with information about our family. He's been stealing from our business partnerships for almost 2 years. Stealing how much? Over $400,000. He was setting up fake vendor accounts and billing for services that were never provided. The money was going directly to accounts controlled by Victoria's network. The revelation that Victoria's people had been stealing from James's business while simultaneously planning to steal my estate showed the comprehensive nature of their criminal operation. They hadn't been content to wait for my conservatorship. They had been looting our family's assets from multiple directions. "James, how did you not notice that kind of money disappearing?" "Because Richard was the one who handled the accounting. He would show me reports that looked legitimate, but they were completely fabricated. I trusted him completely. And now? Now I realized that everything about our business relationship was built on lies. Richard wasn't my partner. He was Victoria's inside man, positioned to manipulate both my business decisions and my personal relationships. 2 weeks after Victoria's arrest, I attended the first hearing in her case. Seeing her in federal court, dressed in an orange jumpsuit instead of her carefully chosen designer outfits, was profoundly satisfying. But what struck me most was how ordinary she looked without her mask of respectability. The woman who had terrorized my family, who had destroyed dozens of other families, who had imprisoned elderly people and stolen their life savings, looked like nothing more than a common criminal. Because that's exactly what she was. During the hearing, the federal prosecutor outlined the scope of the charges against Victoria and her network. The list was staggering: conspiracy, elder abuse, fraud, money laundering, racketeering, kidnapping, and medical abuse. Conservative estimates suggested they had stolen over $80 million from elderly victims across multiple states. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, This case represents one of the largest and most systematic elder abuse operations ever uncovered in the United States. The defendants didn't just steal money. They stole lives, relationships, and dignity from some of our most vulnerable citizens. When Victoria's lawyer stood to speak, he attempted the same psychological manipulation tactics that had been so effective in destroying families. Your Honor, my client was providing legitimate elder care services to families struggling with difficult situations. The elderly individuals in question were genuinely in need of professional care, and the families involved actively participated in all decisions. But this time, the manipulation didn't work. Federal judges, armed with hours of recorded evidence and testimony from dozens of victims, weren't susceptible to Victoria's practiced deceptions. "Counselor," Judge Patricia Williams said coldly, "your client's own recorded words describe these elderly individuals as targets and discuss accelerating timelines for asset seizure. This was not elder care. This was a criminal enterprise." After the hearing, I spoke briefly with several reporters who had been covering the case. The story had captured national attention as an example of how sophisticated criminal networks were targeting America's elderly population. "Mrs. Prescott," one reporter asked, "what would you say to other families who might be facing similar situations?" "I would tell them to trust their instincts. If someone is trying to convince you that your elderly relative is mentally incompetent, if they're pushing for quick decisions about conservatorships or medical care, if they're isolating your family member from their support system, those are red flags that deserve investigation. What advice would you give to elderly people who might be targeted by these networks? Fight back. Don't accept other people's definitions of what you're capable of or what you need. Stay connected to people who love you, maintain your independence, and never let anyone convince you that asking questions or demanding explanations makes you paranoid or difficult." That night, I received a call from Margaret Thompson. She was calling to tell me that her daughter had moved back from Boston to be closer to her, and that they were rebuilding their relationship after the trauma Victoria's network had inflicted on their family. "Caroline," Margaret said, "I wanted you to know that what you did didn't just save me. It saved my relationship with my daughter. She had been convinced that I was losing my mind, and our conversations had become so strained and painful. Now, we're learning to trust each other again. How is that process going? It's hard. There's a lot of damage to repair. But we're doing it together, and we're stronger because we survived this experience. My daughter understands now how easily families can be manipulated and destroyed." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Margaret had articulated something I had been feeling, but hadn't been able to express. Victoria's network hadn't just attacked individual elderly people. They had attacked the fundamental bonds that hold families together. They had weaponized love, trust, and concern, turning them into tools for manipulation and control. But they had also underestimated the power of those same bonds when they're backed by courage and determination. James and I had found our way back to each other. Margaret and her daughter were rebuilding their relationship, and dozens of other families were discovering that their elderly relatives weren't mentally ill. They were victims of crime. Victoria Ashford was facing decades in federal prison. Her criminal network was being systematically dismantled, and their victims were finally free. Justice wasn't just being served. It was being served with the comprehensive thoroughness that only comes when predators choose the wrong target. The hunters had become the hunted, and the prey had turned out to be far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. If this story has shown you how predators target families and how courage can defeat even the most sophisticated criminals, subscribe now, because the final chapters will reveal the ultimate fate of Victoria's network and the lasting impact our fight had on protecting elderly Americans nationwide. 6 months after Victoria's arrest, the trial that would become known as the Elder Abuse Case of the Century began in federal court in Manhattan. I had been asked to be the key witness for the prosecution, a role that would require me to face Victoria Ashford one final time and tell the world exactly how her criminal network had nearly destroyed my family. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victim advocates, and family members of the dozens of elderly people who had been victimized by Victoria's network. I recognized several faces from our investigation: Margaret Thompson, whose freedom had symbolized our victory; David, whose father Harold had been drugged into false dementia for 3 years, and Miranda, whose mother's crimes had nearly cost her the family she had just married into. As I took the stand, I looked directly at Victoria Ashford for the first time since her arrest. She was still trying to project the image of respectability that had made her so dangerous, dressed in a conservative suit and maintaining the posture of someone who had been wrongfully accused. But I could see the desperation in her eyes, the knowledge that her carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled completely. "Mrs. Prescott," the federal prosecutor began, "please tell the court how you first encountered the defendant." For the next 3 hours, I recounted the entire story. Victoria's systematic campaign to isolate me from my son, her manipulation of James and Miranda, the wedding humiliation, and the discovery of the criminal network that had been planning to steal my freedom and my life savings. But the most powerful moment came when I described listening to the recorded conversations where Victoria and her associates discussed their other victims. "Your Honor," I said, looking directly at the judge, "they talked about human beings like we were nothing more than business opportunities. They described elderly people as targets and discussed how to process us most efficiently. They had reduced the systematic destruction of human lives to a corporate profit model." Victoria's lawyer tried to object, claiming that my testimony was prejudicial, but Judge Williams overruled him. "The witness may continue. These are her direct observations of recorded conversations that are already in evidence." I continued describing the moment when Victoria revealed their plan to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked away while they drained my assets. The defendant told my son that the goal wasn't just to control my money, but to demonstrate that I was becoming mentally unstable and unable to care for myself. She had spent months creating situations designed to provoke emotional reactions that she could later use as evidence of my supposed mental decline. The courtroom was completely silent as I described the sophisticated psychological manipulation Victoria had employed, not just against me, but against my son. She convinced James that my love for him was somehow unhealthy, that my involvement in his life was evidence of emotional instability rather than normal maternal concern. She took 30 years of sacrifices I had made for my son and reframed them as symptoms of mental illness. When I finished my testimony, Victoria's lawyer began his cross-examination. I had been preparing for this moment for months, knowing that he would try to use Victoria's own playbook against me in court. "Mrs. Prescott," he began, "isn't it true that you hired private investigators to spy on my client?" "I hired investigators to uncover the truth about a criminal conspiracy that was targeting my family. And isn't it true that you secretly recorded conversations with my client without her knowledge or consent? I documented criminal activities that were being planned against me and other potential victims. Mrs. Prescott, would you describe yourself as someone who holds grudges?" I smiled, recognizing the manipulation tactic he was trying to employ. "Counselor, I would describe myself as someone who believes that criminals should face justice for their crimes. If that's what you call holding a grudge, then yes, I hold grudges." The lawyer continued trying to portray me as a vindictive elderly woman who had orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy against an innocent family counselor, but his efforts fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence we had gathered. When Agent Martinez took the stand, she presented the financial evidence that revealed the true scope of Victoria's network. $87 million stolen from over 200 elderly victims across 12 states, operating through a network of corrupted medical professionals, lawyers, and judges. "Agent Martinez," the prosecutor asked, "in your experience investigating organized crime, how would you classify the defendant's operation?" This was one of the most sophisticated and systematic criminal enterprises I've encountered in 15 years of federal law enforcement. They had created an entire parallel system of medical and legal professionals whose only purpose was to facilitate the theft of elderly people's assets while making it appear completely legitimate. How many elderly individuals were being held against their will in facilities controlled by this network? At the time of the arrests, we identified 93 elderly individuals who were being held under fraudulent conservatorships. Some had been imprisoned for over 5 years. The courtroom gasped at the magnitude of the crimes. 93 human beings locked away and forgotten while criminals systematically stole everything they had worked for their entire lives. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the geriatric specialist who had been part of Victoria's network, had agreed to testify against Victoria in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the medical abuse that was central to their operations. Dr. Chen, the prosecutor asked, please explain to the court how elderly victims were kept compliant in your facilities. We used a combination of powerful psychoactive medications that would induce confusion and docility, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The medications were prescribed based not on medical need, but on the patient's resistance to the conservatorship arrangement. Can you be more specific? If an elderly person questioned their confinement or asked to contact family members, we would increase their medication doses and document their increasing agitation and paranoid behavior as justification for continued institutionalization. Dr. Chen, how many elderly people did you personally medicate in this manner? Over 200 individuals across 4 years. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Dr. Chen had systematically drugged over 200 elderly people to facilitate their financial exploitation. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Richard Hamilton, James's former business partner, who had also agreed to cooperate with the prosecution. Mr. Hamilton, the prosecutor asked, how long were you working with Victoria Ashford's network? Almost 3 years. I was recruited after I developed gambling debts that I couldn't pay. Victoria approached me and offered to resolve my financial problems in exchange for information about wealthy clients and their family situations. What specifically did she ask you to do regarding the Prescott family? I was instructed to gather detailed financial information about Caroline Prescott's assets and to influence James's perception of his mother's mental state. I was also asked to create business problems that would stress their relationship and make James more dependent on outside advice. Did you steal money from James Prescott's business accounts? Yes, over $400,000 across 18 months. The money was used to fund the network's operations while also creating financial stress that would make James more receptive to Victoria's suggestions about his mother's declining judgment. The systematic nature of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Victoria hadn't just been targeting my money. She had been orchestrating a comprehensive psychological warfare campaign designed to destroy my relationship with my son while simultaneously stealing from his business. On the 4th day of the trial, the prosecution played the recorded conversations that James and I had captured during our investigation. Hearing Victoria's voice in that courtroom, casually discussing how to process targets and accelerate timelines, was even more chilling than it had been during our original investigation. But the moment that sealed Victoria's fate came when the prosecution played her recorded confession about planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. The plan was never just about inheritance. Victoria's voice filled the courtroom. It was about demonstrating that Caroline was becoming mentally incompetent, emotionally unstable, unable to manage her own affairs. We documented every emotional reaction, every time she seemed overly dramatic about family changes. We were building a case for conservatorship. The jury's reaction was immediate and visible. Several jurors looked at Victoria with open disgust, and I could see the moment when any remaining doubt about her guilt disappeared completely. When Victoria's lawyer presented her defense, he attempted to portray her as a well-meaning family counselor who had been trying to help families deal with difficult situations involving elderly relatives with declining mental faculties. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "my client dedicated her life to helping families navigate the painful process of caring for elderly relatives who were no longer capable of making sound decisions about their own welfare." But his argument crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The recorded conversations, the financial records, the testimony of nearly 100 victims, all of it painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had nothing to do with legitimate elder care. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, who had specialized in elder abuse cases for over a decade. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, looking directly at the jury, "this case is not about family disputes or difficult decisions about elder care. This case is about one of the most systematic and cruel criminal enterprises in American history. She walked to a large display board that showed photos of Victoria's victims. These are not statistics. These are human beings who worked their entire lives, raised families, contributed to their communities, and deserved to live their final years with dignity and respect. Instead, they were drugged into submission, locked away from their families, and systematically robbed of everything they had earned. She pointed to Margaret Thompson's photo. Margaret Thompson, a retired teacher who spent 40 years educating children, was held prisoner for 8 months while the defendants stole her pension and convinced her daughter that visits would be too traumatic. She pointed to Harold's photo. Harold Williams, a World War II veteran who survived the Battle of the Bulge, was drugged into false dementia for 3 years, while his son believed he was losing his father to Alzheimer's disease. She continued through a dozen more photos, each representing a life destroyed by Victoria's network. The defendant would have you believe this was all a misunderstanding, that she was trying to help families. But her own recorded words tell a different story. She called elderly human beings targets. She discussed processing them efficiently. She planned to have Caroline Prescott declared mentally incompetent, not because of any medical evidence, but because Mrs. Prescott had $8 million that the defendant wanted to steal. As the closing argument continued, I watched Victoria's face carefully. For the first time since the trial began, her mask of respectability had completely slipped. She looked like exactly what she was, a predator who had finally been cornered by her prey. Ladies and gentlemen, Santos concluded, Caroline Prescott saved not just herself, but nearly 100 other elderly Americans who were being held prisoner by this criminal network. She did what law enforcement couldn't do. She infiltrated their operation and exposed their crimes. Now it's your turn to complete the process of justice by holding Victoria Ashford accountable for every life she destroyed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of financial exploitation of elderly persons, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. The list continued for 27 separate charges. Victoria Ashford had been convicted on every count, facing a sentence that would effectively end her life behind bars. But the moment that gave me the greatest satisfaction came when Judge Williams delivered the sentence 3 weeks later. Victoria Ashford, she said, looking directly at the defendant, you have been convicted of crimes that represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust that society places in those who care for our most vulnerable citizens. You systematically targeted elderly Americans, stole their assets, destroyed their families, and imprisoned them while convincing their loved ones that you were providing necessary care. This court sentences you to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution of $87 million to your victims. 45 years. Victoria Ashford, who was 63 years old, would die in federal prison, never again able to harm another elderly person or destroy another family. As the bailiffs led her away, Victoria looked at me one final time, but instead of the hatred I had expected, I saw something else in her eyes, the recognition that she had chosen the wrong target, and that her predatory instincts had finally led her to prey that was more dangerous than she was. The hunters had become the hunted, and justice had been served with the thoroughness that comes when criminals underestimate the intelligence and determination of their intended victims. Subscribe if you believe that predators who target the elderly deserve the harshest possible justice, because the final chapters will reveal the lasting impact this case had on protecting seniors nationwide and the new life James and I built after surviving Victoria's conspiracy. The weeks following Victoria's sentencing were unlike anything I had experienced in my entire life. As news of the trial spread across the country, I began receiving calls from families who had suspected that their elderly relatives were being mistreated in conservatorships but had never known how to prove it. The first call came from a woman named Susan Chen in California. Mrs. Prescott, she said, her voice breaking, I've been watching the news coverage of your case, and I think my father might be a victim of something similar to what happened to you. Tell me what's been happening. My father is 78, a retired engineer who was always sharp as a tack. 2 years ago, his new wife convinced me that he was showing signs of dementia and needed professional care. She found a facility that specializes in elderly care, and my father has been there ever since. What makes you suspicious? Every time I visit him, he seems heavily sedated and confused. But in his lucid moments, he keeps telling me that he's not sick, that he wants to come home, and that his wife is stealing his money. The facility staff says these are classic signs of paranoid delusions associated with his dementia. I felt my blood chill. Susan was describing exactly the same pattern Victoria's network had used with their victims. Susan, what's your father's financial situation? He was quite wealthy when he remarried. Real estate investments, retirement accounts, life insurance policies. His new wife became the beneficiary of everything after they married. And she's the one who initiated the conservatorship proceedings. Yes, she told me it was for his own good, that he was becoming dangerous to himself. I trusted her because I thought she loved him. Over the next 3 hours, Susan told me a story that was heartbreakingly familiar. Her father had been systematically isolated from his family, declared mentally incompetent by doctors he had never seen before, and placed in a facility where he was being kept sedated and confused while his assets were drained. Mrs. Prescott, after seeing your case, I hired a private investigator to look into my father's situation. We discovered that his wife has been working with the same types of professionals you exposed, doctors who specialize in competency evaluations that always conclude the patient needs institutionalization. Susan, you need to contact the FBI immediately. What you're describing sounds like a copycat operation using Victoria's methods. That call was the beginning of what became known as the Prescott Effect, a nationwide awakening to the scope of elder abuse networks operating across the country. Within 6 months of Victoria's conviction, federal investigations had been launched in 23 states, resulting in the discovery of hundreds of additional victims. But perhaps the most gratifying development was the passage of the Elder Justice Protection Act, federal legislation that established strict oversight requirements for conservatorship proceedings and created a national database to track patterns of abuse. Senator Elizabeth Warren called me personally to thank me for exposing the crisis. Mrs. Prescott, she said, your courage in fighting back against Victoria Ashford's network has literally saved thousands of elderly Americans from similar exploitation. The legislation we're passing wouldn't have been possible without the evidence you provided. Senator, I didn't do this to change laws or create national policy. I did it to protect my family. And in protecting your family, you protected thousands of other families. That's the definition of heroism. 3 months after Victoria's sentencing, I received a call that would forever change how I understood the impact of our fight. Agent Martinez was calling to tell me about the release of the final victims from Victoria's network. Mrs. Prescott, I wanted you to be the first to know that Eleanor Hayes was released from custody this morning. She was the last victim being held by Victoria's network. Eleanor Hayes was 91 years old and had been imprisoned for 6 years, longer than any other victim we had identified. Her family had been convinced she had advanced Alzheimer's disease and needed specialized institutional care. How is she? Remarkably strong for someone who endured what she went through. Mrs. Prescott, she asked specifically to meet you. She said she wanted to thank the woman who gave her back her freedom. 2 days later, I drove to Eleanor's home in upstate New York to meet the woman who had become the symbol of everything we had accomplished. I found a tiny, dignified elderly woman who moved slowly, but whose mind was absolutely sharp. Caroline, she said, gripping my hands with surprising strength. They told me for 6 years that I was losing my mind. They convinced my grandson that I didn't recognize him anymore, that visits were too confusing for me. How did you maintain your sanity through all of that? I held on to the truth. Every morning when I woke up in that place, I would repeat my name, my address, my grandson's name, the date of my husband's death, all the facts they were trying to make me forget. I refused to let them erase who I was. Eleanor showed me photographs from her 6 years in captivity, pictures her grandson had taken during his monthly visits, believing he was documenting his grandmother's decline into dementia. In every photo, Eleanor looked heavily sedated and confused, nothing like the alert woman sitting across from me. They were giving me drugs that made me forget where I was, what day it was, sometimes even my own name, she explained. But deep down, I always knew something was wrong. I just couldn't prove it. Eleanor, what kept you fighting? The same thing that kept you fighting, I imagine. The knowledge that giving up meant letting evil win. I wasn't going to let them destroy who I was, even if I couldn't stop them from stealing my money. Eleanor's grandson, David, joined us for lunch, and I watched as they rebuilt the relationship that Victoria's network had nearly destroyed forever. Mrs. Prescott, David said, I spent 6 years believing I was losing my grandmother to Alzheimer's. I would leave those visits feeling heartbroken, thinking she was slipping away from me a little more each time. And now I realized that she was being tortured, and I was unknowingly complicit in it. The guilt is almost unbearable. David, Eleanor said firmly, you were as much a victim as I was. They manipulated you into believing lies because you loved me and wanted what was best for me. That's not your fault. As I drove home from that visit, I reflected on how many families had been reunited because James had found the courage to help me expose Victoria's network. Eleanor and David, Margaret and her daughter, Harold and his son, dozens of families were rebuilding relationships that had been systematically destroyed by criminals who weaponized love and concern. But the victory that meant the most to me personally came 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, when James and Miranda asked me to renew my vows with their family. Mom, James said as we sat in my apartment on a quiet Sunday evening, Miranda and I have been talking, and we want to have a ceremony where we officially welcome you into our marriage as the mother and grandmother you've always been meant to be. A ceremony? We want to redo our wedding, but this time, we want it to be about celebrating family instead of excluding it. We want you in the front row. We want your input on every decision, and we want everyone to understand that you're not just my mother. You're the foundation our family is built on. The ceremony took place on a perfect autumn day in Central Park, near the reservoir, where I had walked every morning during the darkest days of Victoria's manipulation. This time, there were only 25 guests, close friends and family members who had supported us through the crisis. James's vows to Miranda included a promise that I will never forget. I promised to honor the woman who raised me and taught me that family means fighting for each other, not against each other. I promise that our love will be built on truth, not manipulation, and that no one will ever come between us and the people who truly matter. Miranda's vows included her own promise. I promised to cherish Caroline not as an intrusion into our marriage, but as the example of the kind of mother and woman I hope to become. I promise that our children will know their grandmother as the hero who saved our family. When they asked me to speak, I looked out at the small group of people who had stood by us through the worst crisis of our lives, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. 6 months ago, I said, Victoria Ashford tried to convince my son that my love was weakness, that my involvement in his life was unhealthy, and that I was becoming a burden that needed to be managed rather than a person who deserved respect. She was wrong about everything. Love isn't weakness. It's the strongest force in the universe when it's backed by courage and determination. Family involvement isn't intrusion. It's the foundation that allows people to take risks and pursue dreams. And elderly people aren't burdens to be managed. We're resources to be treasured and wisdom to be preserved. I looked directly at James and Miranda. Victoria tried to destroy our family by convincing us that caring for each other was somehow wrong. Instead, she taught us that family is worth fighting for, that truth is worth defending, and that predators who target the people we love will face consequences they never imagined. We're stronger now than we were before Victoria entered our lives, not because we survived her attacks, but because we discovered that when we fight together, we're unstoppable. After the ceremony, as James and I walked along the reservoir where our story had almost ended in tragedy, he asked me a question that revealed how much he had grown through our ordeal. Mom, do you think Victoria was right about one thing? Do you think you sacrificed too much of your own life for me? I considered his question carefully before answering. James, Victoria was wrong about everything, but especially about sacrifice. What she saw as weakness was actually the source of my greatest strength. Every choice I made to put your needs first wasn't a sacrifice, it was an investment. And when our family was under attack, that investment paid dividends that Victoria could never have imagined. What do you mean? I mean that the son I raised was strong enough to recognize evil when he encountered it, courageous enough to help expose it when it mattered most, and loving enough to fight for our relationship even when he had been convinced to work against it. That's not the result of sacrifice, sweetheart. That's the result of love that was invested wisely. As we walked in the gathering dusk, I thought about all the families who were having similar conversations across the country, all the elderly people who were finally free from Victoria's network, and all the predators who had learned that targeting the vulnerable doesn't always lead to easy victories. Victoria Ashford was spending her first months in federal prison, beginning a sentence that would last the rest of her life. Her network had been dismantled, her assets seized, and her methods exposed to law enforcement agencies nationwide. But more importantly, she had failed in her ultimate goal. Instead of destroying my family, she had made us stronger. Instead of isolating me from my son, she had taught us both how precious our relationship really was. Instead of stealing my dignity, she had given me the opportunity to prove that predators who underestimate their prey often become prey themselves. The hunters had become the hunted, and the family Victoria thought she could destroy had emerged more united than ever before. If you believe that family bonds are stronger than any predator who tries to break them, subscribe now for the final chapter, where I'll share the lasting lessons our ordeal taught us and how we're using our experience to protect other families from similar attacks. 1 year after Victoria Ashford was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in federal prison, I received an invitation that would complete the circle of our journey from victims to victors. The National Elder Justice Foundation was awarding me their highest honor, the Courage in Advocacy Award, for exposing Victoria's network and helping to free nearly 100 elderly Americans from fraudulent conservatorships. The ceremony would take place in Washington, D.C., and I would be speaking to an audience of lawmakers, victim advocates, and families who had been affected by similar crimes. James insisted on accompanying me to the ceremony, and as we sat on the train to Washington, I reflected on how completely our lives had changed since that devastating night at his wedding. "Mom," James said, looking out the window at the passing landscape, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found the courage to help you expose Victoria's network?" "I try not to think about it," I replied honestly. "But when I do, I realize that Victoria made one crucial mistake in her assessment of our family." "What mistake?" "She assumed that the love between a mother and son could be permanently destroyed through manipulation and psychological warfare. She thought that if she could convince you to turn against me, I would simply accept defeat and allow myself to be victimized. And instead she discovered that when you attack someone's family, you don't just have to deal with one person's resistance. You have to deal with the combined strength of everyone who loves that family." At the ceremony, I was introduced by Senator Warren as the woman whose courage sparked a national awakening to the crisis of elder abuse in America. As I walked to the podium, I looked out at an audience that included Margaret Thompson, Eleanor Hayes, Harold Williams, and dozens of other elderly people who had been freed from Victoria's network. But the person I was really speaking to was sitting in the front row, James, my son, who had found the strength to choose truth over manipulation when it mattered most. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, 13 months ago, I was a retired lawyer living quietly in Manhattan, enjoying what I thought would be a peaceful relationship with my son and his new wife. I had no idea that I had been selected as a target by one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in American history. Victoria Ashford and her associates spent months studying my family, identifying our vulnerabilities, and planning how to systematically destroy our relationships while stealing everything I had worked for during my lifetime. They almost succeeded. I paused and looked directly at James. They almost succeeded because they understood something that many of us forget. The bonds that hold families together can be weaponized by people who understand human psychology and have no moral constraints about exploiting our deepest emotions. Victoria convinced my son that my love for him was unhealthy, that my involvement in his life was problematic, and that my emotional reactions to their manipulation were signs of mental instability. She turned 30 years of maternal devotion into evidence of psychological dysfunction. But Victoria made one critical error in her assessment of our family. She assumed that love could be permanently poisoned through lies and manipulation. She thought that once she convinced my son to turn against me, I would simply accept my fate as a victim. I looked out at the audience of families who had survived similar attacks. What Victoria didn't understand is that real love, the kind that's built on decades of shared experiences, mutual respect, and genuine care, is stronger than any manipulation tactic. It can be wounded, it can be confused, it can even appear to be destroyed, but it cannot be permanently eliminated by people who mistake psychological manipulation for real power. My son found the courage to question the lies he had been told, to investigate the truth behind Victoria's influence, and to help me expose the criminal network that was targeting our family. In doing so, he didn't just save me from their conspiracy. He saved 93 other elderly Americans who were being held prisoner by the same criminals. The applause was thunderous, but I held up my hand because I had something more important to say. The question people ask me most often is, how do families protect themselves from predators like Victoria Ashford? The answer isn't complicated, but it requires vigilance and courage. First, trust your instincts. If someone is trying to convince you that an elderly family member is mentally incompetent, if they're pushing for quick decisions about conservatorships or institutional care, if they're isolating your relative from their support system, those are red flags that deserve investigation, not acceptance. Second, maintain direct relationships with your elderly family members. Don't allow anyone, no matter how professional they appear, to control or limit your access to people you love. Isolation is the predator's most powerful weapon. Third, remember that competency is not determined by emotional reactions or strong opinions. An elderly person who gets angry about being mistreated, who asks difficult questions about their care, or who demands to maintain their independence is not automatically incompetent. They may be the most competent person in the room. Fourth, follow the money. If someone is benefiting financially from an elderly person's supposed incompetence, if they're making decisions that primarily serve their own interests, if they're resistant to transparency about financial arrangements, investigate immediately. I paused and looked around the room at faces that reflected both the pain of victimization and the strength that comes from surviving it. But most importantly, remember that predators like Victoria Ashford count on families being too polite, too trusting, or too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. They assume that elderly people are automatically vulnerable and that adult children can be easily manipulated through guilt and fear. They're wrong. We're not as helpless as they think we are, we're not as isolated as they try to make us, and we're certainly not as weak as they assume. When we fight back with intelligence, determination, and the kind of love that refuses to be destroyed, predators discover that they've chosen the wrong targets. After the ceremony, James and I attended a reception where we met with dozens of families who had been affected by elder abuse networks similar to Victoria's. Each story was unique in its details, but identical in its fundamental pattern: systematic isolation, psychological manipulation, and financial exploitation disguised as legitimate care. But what struck me most powerfully was the strength of the survivors. These weren't broken victims. They were warriors who had fought back against sophisticated criminals and won. They had reclaimed their dignity, rebuilt their relationships, and were now using their experiences to protect other families. Mrs. Prescott, said a woman named Dorothy Kim, whose father had been held in one of Victoria's facilities for 2 years. I wanted to thank you for showing us that it was possible to fight back. Before your case, we thought we were crazy for questioning the professionals who were caring for our father. Dorothy, you weren't crazy. You were right to question them. That instinct to protect your father, that was exactly what Victoria's network was trying to suppress. And it worked, until we saw your story and realized that what happened to our family wasn't unique. That gave us the courage to hire our own investigators and demand answers. As the evening was ending, James and I found ourselves alone on the hotel balcony, looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need you to know something. What Victoria did to our family, the way she manipulated me into turning against you, that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." "James." "No, let me finish. I've spent the past year in therapy, trying to understand how I could have been so completely fooled by someone whose motives were so obviously selfish. And what I've learned is that Victoria succeeded with me because she exploited the one thing I was most insecure about, which was whether I was strong enough to be the kind of man you deserved as a son. You sacrificed so much for me, achieved so much in your own life, and I was always afraid that I could never measure up to your example. I felt tears welling in my eyes as I understood what he was saying. Victoria convinced me that your expectations were unreasonable, that your involvement in my life was excessive, and that I needed to establish independence from your influence. She took my deepest insecurity and used it as a weapon against our relationship. But you found your way back to the truth, only because you fought for me, even when I didn't deserve it. Only because you loved me enough to risk everything to expose the people who were manipulating both of us. James turned to face me directly. Mom, I want you to know that what you did, fighting back against Victoria's network, exposing their crimes, saving all those families, that's the most heroic thing I've ever witnessed, and I'm proud to be your son. We stood together in the Washington night, mother and son, survivors of an ordeal that had nearly destroyed us, but had ultimately made our bond stronger than ever before. 6 months later, I received a letter from Victoria Ashford in federal prison. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was a single page, handwritten on prison stationery. Caroline, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go as far as they did. When we first identified your family as potential clients, I genuinely believed we were providing a necessary service to families dealing with difficult elder care situations. But you were different from our usual targets. You were stronger, smarter, and more resourceful than I anticipated. Instead of accepting your situation, you fought back with a level of intelligence and determination that I had never encountered. I underestimated you completely, and that underestimation destroyed my life and the lives of everyone who worked with me. I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not claiming that what we did was justified. I'm simply acknowledging that you defeated me completely and that you deserved to win. The elderly people we held in our facilities are free because of your courage. The families we manipulated are reunited because of your determination. The criminal network we built is destroyed because you were stronger than we were. I hope you understand that what you accomplished goes far beyond saving your own family. You saved hundreds of families and exposed a problem that law enforcement didn't even know existed. You won, Caroline, completely and permanently. Victoria, I read the letter 3 times, then placed it in the file I maintained of documents related to our case. Victoria's acknowledgement of defeat was gratifying, but it wasn't necessary. I had known we had won from the moment federal agents placed her in handcuffs. Today, 2 years after Victoria's conviction, I maintain a different kind of law practice. I work exclusively with families who suspect their elderly relatives are being victimized by conservatorship fraud. And I help law enforcement agencies identify and prosecute elder abuse networks. James has rebuilt his business with new partners he has thoroughly vetted, and he calls me every Sunday without fail. Miranda and I have developed the close relationship that Victoria tried to prevent, and she frequently asks for my advice on everything from career decisions to recipes for family dinners. Most importantly, we've learned to recognize manipulation when we encounter it, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and to fight back immediately when predators target our family. Victoria Ashford taught us that evil is real, that it's sophisticated, and that it specifically targets the bonds that hold families together. But she also taught us that love backed by courage and intelligence is stronger than any manipulation tactic devised by criminals. The hunters became the hunted, the predators became the prey, and a family that was nearly destroyed emerged stronger than ever before. And somewhere in a federal prison, Victoria Ashford begins each day knowing that when she chose to target Caroline Prescott's family, she made the biggest mistake of her criminal career. Justice was served, families were saved, and the woman who thought she could destroy everything I had built learned that some prey fights back. The lesson is simple. When you target someone's family, you had better be prepared for war. Because when love is threatened by evil, love has a way of winning battles that seemed impossible to fight.